Picture this. It's a moonless night in 1582, and inside Osaka Castle, a guard makes his rounds, completely unaware that the monk he passed earlier isn't a monk at all. Within hours, the castle's defenses will be compromised not by an army battering at the gates, but by a single man who slipped through using nothing but deception, patience, and skills honed over decades. This is the world of the shinobi, the ninja, where shadows are allies, and information is more valuable than any sword. But here's what most people don't know. Many of these legendary spies weren't peasants or outcasts as popular culture suggests. They were samurai, the very warriors bound by honor codes that supposedly forbade such tactics. Welcome to the hidden history of Japanese espionage, where the line between honorable warrior and cunning spy was far blurrier than anyone imagined. When we think of feudal Japan, the figures dominate our imagination: the noble samurai warrior, standing tall in gleaming armor, and the mysterious ninja, dressed in black, scaling castle walls under cover of darkness. These images have been burned into popular culture through countless films, anime, and video games. But the real story is far more complex and infinitely more fascinating than Hollywood would have you believe. The relationship between samurai and ninja wasn't one of opposition, but often one of necessity, pragmatism, and surprising overlap. To understand how espionage truly functioned in medieval Japan, we need to strip away the myths and examine the historical reality of these two warrior classes. Let's start with the samurai, because understanding them is crucial to understanding why ninja existed at all. The samurai were members of Japan's military nobility, highly trained warriors who served powerful feudal lords called daimyo. They weren't just fighters. They were an entire social class with strict codes of conduct, political power, and cultural influence. The samurai followed Bushido, the way of the warrior, which emphasized loyalty, honor, courage, and above all, the importance of facing one's enemies directly in open combat. A samurai was expected to announce himself before battle, to fight with dignity, and to prefer death over dishonor. This wasn't just philosophy. It was the foundation of their entire identity and social status. But here's the problem with honor codes in times of war. They are a luxury that not every situation allows. Imagine you're a daimyo in the 15th or 16th century during the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. Japan has fractured into dozens of competing territories, each ruled by ambitious warlords locked in constant conflict. You need to know what your enemies are planning. You need to understand their troop movements, their supply lines, their alliances. You need to sow discord in their ranks, sabotage their resources, and occasionally eliminate key figures who pose threats to your power. Open battle is expensive, unpredictable, and costly in terms of lives and resources. What you really need is information, and you need operatives willing to obtain it by any means necessary. This is where the shinobi enter the story. The word ninja is actually a modern term that became popular in the 20th century. Historically, these operatives were called shinobi, which can be translated as one who endures or one who hides. The formalization of their craft, known as ninjutsu, emerged around the 12th century through a fascinating origin story. According to historical accounts, a samurai named Daisuke Tagakuri lost his lands and, rather than commit ritual suicide as honor might have demanded, chose survival. He encountered a Chinese warrior monk named Kane Doshi, and together they developed a system of unconventional warfare that would eventually evolve into the sophisticated espionage techniques associated with the ninja. The mountainous regions of Iga and Koga became the heartland of shinobi culture. These remote, difficult-to-govern areas provided perfect training grounds and safe havens for developing techniques that the mainstream samurai class consider beneath them. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The shinobi weren't some separate peasant underclass as popular myths suggest. Research into historical records reveals something remarkable. Many shinobi were actually samurai themselves, warriors who had received special training and were willing to undertake missions that might be considered dishonorable by strict Bushido standards, but were absolutely necessary for their lord's survival and success. Think about the practical reality of medieval Japanese warfare. A daimyo couldn't publicly acknowledge that he employed spies and saboteurs without damaging his own reputation and that of his legitimate samurai forces. The fiction of honorable warfare had to be maintained for political and social reasons. But privately, every successful warlord understood that intelligence gathering and covert operations were essential tools of statecraft. So they employed shinobi, sometimes recruiting them from lower classes and training them from childhood, but often tasking their own samurai with these missions. These samurai shinobi operated in a complex gray area, maintaining their official status while secretly conducting operations that the public face of samurai culture would never acknowledge. The shinobi's role expanded far beyond the Hollywood image of black-clad assassins. Historical research shows they served as propaganda agents, spreading rumors and misinformation to demoralize enemy forces or turn populations against rival daimyo. They worked as spy hunters, tasked with identifying and eliminating enemy intelligence operatives. They functioned as commando units, conducting raids and sabotage operations. They served as topographers, mapping enemy territories and identifying strategic weaknesses in fortifications. They worked as advanced scouts, gathering tactical intelligence before major military operations. They helped defend castles and military camps, using their knowledge of infiltration to prevent enemy spies from doing the same. And yes, they served as classic spies, embedding themselves in enemy territory to gather long-term intelligence. One of the most famous examples of a samurai shinobi was Hattori Hanzo, who served Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of the most powerful figures in Japanese history. Hanzo was born into a samurai family and held legitimate samurai status. Yet he was also a master of ninjutsu and commanded a force of shinobi operatives. He helped Ieyasu escape enemy territory after a devastating betrayal, using his network of spies and his own considerable skills to navigate hostile lands. When Ieyasu eventually became shogun and unified Japan, Hanzo's contributions were openly acknowledged, demonstrating that the most successful leaders understood the value of both honorable warfare and covert operations. The success of figures like Hattori Hanzo reveals something profound about the nature of power and feudal Japan. While the public narrative celebrated samurai virtues of open combat and honorable death, the private reality of governance demanded a far more sophisticated approach to conflict. The daimyo who survived and thrived during the brutal Sengoku period weren't necessarily the ones with the most honorable warriors. They were the ones who best understood how to blend conventional military might with unconventional intelligence operations. This pragmatic approach to warfare created a golden age for shinobi activities, transforming espionage from a shameful necessity into an art form that would influence military thinking for centuries. The Sengoku period, spanning from 1467 to 1615, created perfect conditions for the flourishing of shinobi operations, with Japan fragmented into competing domains and alliances shifting constantly. Information became the most valuable commodity in the land. A daimyo who knew his enemy's plans even a day in advance held an enormous advantage. A lord who could plant false information in enemy councils could win battles without ever drawing a sword. This environment didn't just tolerate shinobi, it demanded them. Every major power employed intelligence networks, and the competition between these networks became as fierce as the battles between samurai armies. The training of a shinobi was extraordinarily comprehensive, far beyond the simple assassination skills that movies emphasize. A proper shinobi education began in childhood and encompassed an astonishing range of disciplines. Physical training included not just combat skills but specializations that most samurai would never master. Shinobi learned to move silently across different types of terrain, to climb walls and trees with minimal equipment, to swim long distances while carrying supplies, and to endure extreme discomfort for extended periods. They practiced a form of combat called taijutsu that emphasized efficiency over elegance, focusing on quick strikes to vulnerable points rather than the formal sword techniques that samurai studied. But the physical skills were only one dimension of shinobi training. Mental disciplines were equally important, perhaps even more so. A shinobi needed to master the art of disguise, which went far beyond simply wearing different clothes. They studied the mannerisms, speech patterns, and social customs of different classes and professions. A shinobi might spend months learning how to convincingly portray a traveling merchant, complete with knowledge of trade routes, prices, and commercial practices. Another might study Buddhist texts and ceremonies to pass as a monk, or learn carpentry skills to infiltrate a castle as a craftsman hired for repairs. The goal was to hide in plain sight, to become so thoroughly convincing in a role that even careful scrutiny wouldn't reveal the deception. Memory training was another crucial element of shinobi education. Without the ability to write down sensitive information without risk of discovery, shinobi developed extraordinary mnemonic techniques. They learned to memorize complex layouts of castles and fortifications, to recall conversations word for word, to remember the faces and names of dozens or even hundreds of individuals. Some historical accounts describe shinobi who could listen to enemy war councils and later reproduce entire strategic discussions for their own lords. This required not just natural memory but systematic training in memory palaces and other cognitive techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period. The tools and weapons associated with shinobi are often misunderstood or exaggerated in popular culture. The iconic black outfit, for instance, is largely a theatrical invention. Historical evidence suggests that shinobi typically wore clothing appropriate to whatever role they were playing. When operating at night, they favored dark blue rather than black, as it blended better with nighttime shadows and was less conspicuous if partially illuminated. The famous shuriken, or throwing stars, existed but were minor weapons, more useful for distraction or creating brief opportunities than for actual killing. A shinobi's real weapons were far more practical and versatile. The sword carried by shinobi differed from the curved katana of the samurai. Shinobi blades were often shorter and straighter, easier to conceal and more useful in confined spaces. The scabbard itself might serve multiple purposes, functioning as a breathing tube when hiding underwater or as a step when climbing walls. Many shinobi carried chains with weighted ends that could be used as weapons, climbing aids, or tools for creating diversions, caltrops. Small spike devices scattered on paths to enter pursuers were common because they were easy to carry and highly effective. Poisons derived from plants and minerals were carefully studied, not just for assassination, but for incapacitating guards or animals. Perhaps the most important tool in a shinobi's arsenal was social engineering. Though they wouldn't have used the modern term, shinobi were masters of human psychology, understanding how to exploit trust, greed, fear, and vanity to achieve their objectives. They studied the weaknesses of their targets obsessively. A guard who gambled heavily might be approached by a friendly stranger who offered to lend money, gradually building a relationship based on obligation and debt. A low-ranking official frustrated by his lack of advancement might find a sympathetic ear in someone who seemed to share his grievances. Over weeks or months, these relationships would be cultivated until the shinobi could extract information or gain access. That would have been impossible through force. The great shinobi families of Iga and Koga developed sophisticated organizational structures that functioned much like modern intelligence agencies. They maintained extensive networks of informants across Japan, people in various positions who could provide valuable information. Some were conscious agents, actively working for shinobi families in exchange for payment or protection. Others were unwitting sources, people who simply talked too much to the friendly merchant or helpful servant who was actually gathering intelligence. The shinobi families kept detailed records of their networks, carefully protecting this information as their most valuable asset. Communication methods used by shinobi networks were remarkably sophisticated. They employed various codes and ciphers to send messages that would appear innocuous if intercepted. A letter discussing rice prices might actually contain intelligence about troop movements, with the numbers corresponding to predetermined meanings. Dead drops allowed information to be passed without direct contact between agents. Certain symbols carved into trees or scratched onto walls conveyed simple messages to other operatives. Some shinobi used specially trained animals, particularly birds, to carry messages over distances, though this was less common than legend suggests. The social position of shinobi remained ambiguous throughout their active period. Those from samurai families maintained their official status while conducting covert operations, living double lives that required extraordinary discipline and compartmentalization. Lower-class shinobi occupied a strange space in Japanese society, neither fully accepted nor entirely condemned. Their services were necessary and valuable, but their methods violated the aesthetic of honor that Japanese culture officially celebrated. This created a persistent tension that was never fully resolved during the feudal period. This tension between necessity and honor became most apparent during actual operations, where the gap between samurai ideals and shinobi realities couldn't have been starker. When a samurai army marched to war, banners flew, drums beat, and heralds announced their approach. The very act of battle was a public performance, a demonstration of courage and martial prowess that would be recorded in chronicles and celebrated in songs. But when a shinobi went to work, success meant that no one ever knew they had been there at all. The perfect operation left no trace, no witnesses, and no evidence. While samurai sought glory that would echo through generations, shinobi sought invisibility that would be forgotten by morning. The techniques employed during castle infiltration demonstrate the sophistication of shinobi tradecraft. Castles in feudal Japan were designed with security as a paramount concern, featuring multiple walls, complex layouts, and architectural features specifically intended to thwart intruders. Stone walls were built with carefully fitted rocks that offered few handholds. Interior floors were constructed with nightingale boards that chirped when walked upon, making silent movement nearly impossible. Corridors included sharp turns and concealed alcoves where guards could observe without being seen. Windows were small and heavily barred, yet shinobi regularly penetrated these fortifications, not through supernatural abilities but through meticulous planning and extraordinary patience. A typical infiltration might begin weeks or even months before the actual operation. The shinobi would first gather intelligence about the castle's layout, guard rotations, and the habits of its inhabitants. This information came from multiple sources: servants who could be bribed or seduced, merchants who delivered supplies, craftsmen hired for repairs, or even other shinobi who had previously operated in the area. The operative would create a detailed mental map of the target, identifying weak points, optimal entry and exit routes, and potential hiding places. Every guard's routine would be memorized, every dog's temperament noted, every squeaky door identified. The actual infiltration often exploited human factors rather than physical vulnerabilities. A shinobi might arrive at a castle disguised as a laborer, volunteer for the dirtiest and most unpleasant jobs, and work diligently for weeks while secretly mapping the interior and identifying security gaps. Others pose as entertainers, taking advantage of the fact that traveling performers were common and expected to move through different areas of a castle to perform for various residents. Some infiltrated as religious figures, knowing that refusing entry to a monk or priest carried social and spiritual risks that many guards were unwilling to take. The key was always to provide a legitimate reason for being present that was so mundane and ordinary that no one would question it closely. Once inside, the shinobi faced the challenge of completing their mission while maintaining their cover. If the objective was gathering intelligence, this might involve eavesdropping on private conversations, examining documents in restricted areas, or observing military preparations. The shinobi needed to balance thoroughness with speed. gathering as much information as possible while minimizing the risk of discovery. They developed remarkable abilities to read documents quickly in poor lighting, to memorize architectural details after brief observation, and to piece together strategic plans from fragmentary evidence. Some missions required multiple infiltrations, with the operative gradually building a complete picture over time. Assassination missions, though less common than popular culture suggests, required even more careful execution. The shinobi needed to eliminate the target in a way that wouldn't immediately trigger a massive manhunt or reveal that foul play had occurred. Poison was often preferred because it could simulate natural illness, especially in an era when medical understanding was limited. A target who died from apparent food poisoning or sudden illness would provoke far less investigation than one found with a knife in his back. The shinobi might contaminate food or drink, introduce poison through skin contact, or even use delayed action toxins that wouldn't take effect until the operative had safely departed. Some poisons were designed to cause symptoms that mimicked specific diseases, adding another layer of misdirection when direct violence was unavoidable. Shinobi strikes were designed for maximum efficiency with minimum noise. Techniques focused on attacking vulnerable points, the throat to prevent screaming, major blood vessels to cause rapid unconsciousness, or specific points on the spine to cause instant paralysis. Unlike the formal sword duels of samurai culture, shinobi combat was brutally pragmatic, with no concern for aesthetics or honor. The goal was to neutralize the threat as quickly and quietly as possible, then continue with the mission. If a body needed to be hidden, shinobi knew how to make it difficult to find, using everything from concealed spaces within castles to disposal in wells or latrines, where discovery would be delayed. Escape and evasion were perhaps the most critical skills a shinobi could possess, because even the most successful mission meant nothing if the operative was captured afterward. Shinobi planned multiple escape routes before beginning any operation, identifying not just the optimal path, but several alternatives in case the primary route was compromised. They studied the surrounding terrain exhaustively, knowing which roads would be watched, which rivers could be forded, which forests offered concealment, and which villages might provide temporary shelter. Some shinobi maintained safe houses throughout their operational areas, places where they could rest, change disguises, or wait for pursuit to move past them. Pursuit evasion techniques were highly developed and remarkably creative. Shinobi might carry small bags of pepper or irritating powders to throw in the faces of dogs or pursuers, temporarily disabling them. They used caltrops not just to injure, but to slow down mounted pursuit on roads. Some carried small quantities of flammable materials that could be used to create diversions, drawing attention in one direction while they fled in another. They understood how to use water to break their scent trail, how to walk backward in their own footprints to confuse trackers, and how to climb trees or hide in underbrush in ways that made visual detection extremely difficult. The psychological aspect of being a shinobi was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. These operatives lived double or triple lives, maintaining cover identities that might extend for months or years. A shinobi embedded as a merchant's assistant couldn't simply turn off their role when alone. They had to embody that identity completely, thinking and acting like the person they pretended to be at all times. The stress of constant deception, the knowledge that a single mistake could mean capture and execution, and the isolation from normal social connections took an enormous toll. Shinobi training included mental disciplines, designed to help operatives compartmentalize their lives, maintain emotional stability under pressure, and resist interrogation if captured. The interrogation resistance training was particularly brutal because capture was a real possibility and the consequences were severe. Shinobi who were caught faced torture designed not just to extract information, but to serve as public deterrence against espionage. They were trained to withstand various forms of pain, to provide false information convincingly when resistance became impossible, and to protect the most critical intelligence for as long as humanly possible. The methods used to break captured shinobi were as sophisticated as the techniques used to train them. Interrogators understood that physical torture alone often produced unreliable information, as victims would say anything to make the pain stop. Instead, they employed psychological techniques alongside physical coercion, alternating between brutality and false kindness, offering hope of mercy in exchange for cooperation or threatening harm to family members. Some interrogators specialized in creating environments of complete sensory deprivation, breaking down a prisoner's sense of time and reality until their resistance crumbled. The most skilled shinobi could sometimes resist for days, buying time for their networks to relocate and their handlers to take protective measures. But everyone had a breaking point. The acknowledgement of this reality made shinobi networks design their operations with compartmentalization, ensuring that even if one operative was captured and broke under interrogation, the damage to the broader organization would be limited. The decline of the shinobi began ironically with the success of the very forces they had helped build. When Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified Japan in 1603 and established the Tokugawa shogunate, he ushered in the Edo period, an era of relative peace that would last for over 250 years. The constant warfare that had made shinobi services indispensable suddenly ended. The new government, seeking to consolidate power and eliminate potential threats, began systematically dismantling the autonomous shinobi communities of Iga and Koga. Many shinobi families were forced to disband, their members absorbed into official government positions, or forced to abandon their traditions entirely. Some shinobi found new roles in the Tokugawa government's intelligence apparatus. The shogunate maintained extensive spy networks to monitor the daimyo and ensure no one was plotting rebellion against the central authority. Former shinobi brought their expertise to these operations, though now working for a unified state rather than competing warlords. Others became police investigators, using their skills in surveillance and interrogation to maintain civil order. The famous Onawaban, the shogun's private intelligence service, employed many individuals trained in shinobi techniques. Though they were never officially acknowledged as such, the skills remained valuable. But the independent shinobi culture that had flourished during the Warring States period gradually faded into history. The transformation of ninja from historical reality to cultural legend began during the Edo period itself. When the actual shinobi largely disappeared, they became characters in popular entertainment. Kabuki theater featured ninja as mysterious figures with exaggerated abilities, capable of impossible feats that bore little resemblance to the careful, methodical work of actual intelligence operatives. These theatrical representations established many of the visual conventions we recognize today: the all-black costume, the supernatural abilities, the exotic weapons. Later, during the 19th and 20th centuries, popular novels and eventually films further embellished these myths, creating the ninja of modern imagination who could turn invisible, walk on water, and perform magical feats. The historical reality, while less fantastical, was in many ways more impressive than the myths. Real shinobi achieved remarkable things through human excellence rather than supernatural powers. They gathered intelligence that changed the course of battles and altered the fate of entire domains. They carried out operations of breathtaking complexity with minimal resources and support. They mastered disciplines that required years of dedicated training and constant practice. Perhaps most impressively, they did all of this while navigating the complex social and moral terrain of feudal Japanese society, balancing the demands of their craft against the values of the culture they served. The relationship between samurai and shinobi remained complex right up until both groups faded from active military relevance. Many samurai despised shinobi methods, viewing them as dishonorable and beneath the dignity of true warriors. Yet these same samurai benefited enormously from the intelligence shinobi provided and the operations they conducted. The cognitive dissonance created by this situation was never fully resolved. Japanese culture celebrated the samurai ideal, while quietly acknowledging the necessity of shinobi pragmatism, maintaining a public fiction of honorable warfare, while privately engaging in sophisticated espionage. This duality reveals something profound about how societies reconcile idealistic values with practical necessities, a tension that remains relevant even in our modern world. The legacy of the shinobi extends far beyond Japan's borders and their historical period. Modern intelligence agencies around the world employ techniques that would be recognizable to medieval Japanese spies: the use of covert identities, the cultivation of human sources, the employment of codes and ciphers, the emphasis on patience and long-term operations. The psychological principles that shinobi understood intuitively have been formalized into modern social engineering and intelligence tradecraft. The recognition that information is often more valuable than military force, that a well-placed agent can achieve what an army cannot, that deception and misdirection are legitimate tools of statecraft. All these insights that shinobi embodied are now fundamental to how nations conduct intelligence operations. For the samurai shinobi themselves, those warriors who lived in both worlds, the experience must have been extraordinarily challenging. By day, they maintained the dignified bearing and honorable conduct expected of their class. They participated in formal ceremonies, trained in traditional martial arts, and upheld the values of Bushido in their public lives. But when duty called, they shed those constraints and became something else entirely, operating in shadows and using methods that violated everything their public persona stood for. The psychological cost of this duality is hard to imagine, yet many managed to maintain both identities throughout their careers, suggesting a remarkable capacity for compartmentalization and a deep pragmatism about the realities of power. The story of samurai spies and Japanese ninja ultimately teaches us that history is rarely as simple as our myths suggest. The neat categories we create: honorable warrior versus cunning spy, open combat versus covert operation, samurai versus ninja, break down when we examine the actual historical record. Real people in real situations made complex choices based on competing values and practical necessities. The samurai who became shinobi weren't betraying their principles. They were expanding their understanding of what service to their lords required. The daimyo who employed spies weren't hypocrites. They were leaders who understood that survival and success demanded flexibility rather than rigid adherence to ideals. If you found this exploration of medieval Japanese espionage fascinating, there's so much more to discover in the world of ancient and medieval intelligence operations. From the spy networks of ancient Rome to the intricate espionage systems of the Byzantine Empire, from the intelligence operations of medieval Islamic caliphates to the secret agents of medieval China, history is filled with remarkable stories of how our ancestors gathered information, deceived their enemies, and shaped the course of events through cunning rather than force. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next video in our Ancient and Medieval Espionage series. Drop a comment below and let me know which historical spy network you'd like us to explore next. Did the sophistication of shinobi operations surprise you? What other aspects of medieval Japanese warfare would you like to learn about? Your suggestions help shape future content, so don't be shy. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden world of samurai spies and ninja, give this video a thumbs up and share it with anyone who loves history, espionage, or just learning about how the real world was often stranger and more interesting than fiction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we continue our journey through the secret history of espionage.